They left her to die. In a narrow stand of pines, the ranger dangled upside down, her ankles cinched tight in rough rope, wrists bound behind her back. Blood drained into her skull and stars burst in her vision. The forest pressed in, a silence heavy enough to smother thought. Every beat of her heart slowed, and she knew her body was running out of time. Through the blur, shapes drifted into view. At first she thought it was her failing mind. 3 broad, low figures, circling her, as if drawn by the scent of fear and sweat. Not wolves, not coyotes. Instead, 3 pigs wandered out of the thicket. Pink flanks streaked with mud, tusk stubs glinting in the filtered light. They snorted, uncertain, curious. One sniffed at her boot, another rubbed against the tree trunk. The third tilted its head, staring at her with small black eyes that held no judgment, only intent regard. Their presence was strange, out of place here where no farm sat within miles. But they were solid, living, and watching her. Her throat rasped as she tried to call out. The rope cut deeper into her skin, sending needles of pain through her legs. The pigs huffed and shifted, confused by her sounds. Still, they did not leave. In that moment, with her vision fading, those 3 pigs were the only chance she had left. The wilderness carried no mercy. Alone, she had hours, maybe less. With them, maybe something else. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Because this is no ordinary tale of survival in the bush. This is a story of what happens when the wilderness offers help in the shape you'd least expect. The sun crept another finger's width across the canopy. The ranger's breaths came ragged. Sweat dripped from her hair down into the dirt below. The pigs shuffled closer, circling, grunting low like they sensed the urgency that pulsed with each fading heartbeat. Alone in the forest, bound and suspended, she found herself relying not on her training nor her will, but on the mystery of 3 pigs who had wandered into her dying orbit. And with that, the story begins. The ranger's patrol had started as so many had before. Early morning fog lifting off the valley, boots damp with dew, the air sharp with resin from fresh-cut spruces. This land was familiar ground, a patch of wilderness she walked week after week, charting the trails, checking for trespass signs, surveying wildlife populations. Alone work, but she preferred it that way. Her colleagues called her stubborn, choosing the most remote post. She called it clarity. Out here, in the ridges and gullies, she could breathe. The silence suited her more than chatter ever could. But the silence had carried danger into it that morning. She had marked boot prints where none should be, heavy tracks pressed deep in the soil. Hunters without permits. Not ordinary hunters either. These were men chasing profit, setting snares and running guns in lands that weren't theirs. She followed the tracks without hesitation, because that was her job. Protect the land, protect the animals, and stop the ones who sought to bleed the wilderness empty. She never expected them to find her first. Between 2 ridges, on a narrow game path, they struck. Something slammed her side and drove her down. She remembers rough hands, laughter like gravel, the smell of sweat and smoke. They took her radio, her sidearm, her knife, useless without tools. They hauled her upright, binding her wrists before she could fully catch breath. She fought. Of course she did. Years spent in uniform hadn't left her weak. She twisted, broke one man's nose with her forehead, but another clamped an arm across her throat. They laughed harder. The blows came next. Then the blackness swirled, drowning her senses. When she returned, she was upside down, hanging from a tree limb, left as food for silence, or worse. Their last words drifted back. No one's coming this way. By tomorrow, not much left. She pressed her eyes shut, forcing breath steady as her head throbbed. She wasn't a stranger to being pinned. Combat had taught her what helplessness felt like, back in another country where desert heat baked the bones. She had survived that. She intended to survive this, though the odds stacked cruelly. Why had she chosen this lonely post? 10 years after the service, the noise of towns had been too much. She had traded crowded bars for campfires, traffic lights for the steady rhythm of the patrol. She told herself the wilderness made sense. Simple rules, clear signs, no masks. Out here you saw truth in tracks and weather, not in politics or small talk. Memories cut in where pain threatened. Faces of patrol comrades, some still breathing, some not. She remembered carrying a broken man 3 miles under fire, every step a gamble. That had carved scars into her back, scars that throbbed now as rope ground against her muscles. She opened her eyes. The forest spun. Sweat dripped toward the sky because for her gravity had reversed. The rope seared at her skin. Each sway sent fire through her chest. She tried to twist, test the binding, but the fibers only dug deeper. It might have ended there. Hours strung up until the organs collapsed. Coyotes finding her before dawn. That was the tally death offered. But then the pigs entered her fading world. She could not make sense of them. Not yet. 3 broad bodies pushing through undergrowth, rooting at leaves, moving like shadows shaped of flesh and grit. She blinked, half believing the sight was some fever born of pressure in her skull. But no. When one touched its snout to her boot, the weight was real. The grunt that rumbled from its chest was earthbound sound, not dream. Hope crept in, thin as a thread. These creatures weren't predators. They weren't ghosts of comrades. They were pigs, rough and restless, living symbols of persistence. And somehow, they were here. For a moment, she wanted to laugh, but the blood in her throat choked it back. What chance could pigs give? And yet they were the only eyes to see her strung against the sky. She inhaled through grit teeth. She had maybe hours to solve this. Every second upside down, thickened blood, blurred thought. Every second wasted shrank the span of life left. She wished for her knife. One swipe could cut the rope and drop her free. But she had nothing, not even the strength to bite through fibers. Pain pulled memory back again. The draw of desert wind across open kill zones, makeshift rescue plans forged in seconds. Adapt, improvise, endure. That mantra came alive. Beside her, she heard the pigs rustle, move. Not just dumb creatures, they lingered, watching. She whispered, throat raw, "Here, here." Barely more than rasp, but one pig lifted its head. It studied her, ear twitching. Maybe sound reached it. Maybe, she thought, just maybe, she would not end in silence. The forest's rhythm didn't stop for her pain. Wind slid low through the branches, rattling pine needles, carrying the scent of damp soil and resin. Somewhere far off, a jay scolded. And then, soft snorts, closer than breath. The pigs had arrived in force, though they moved with unhurried intent, almost as though this trail had always belonged to them. 3 shapes at first, broad, muscled torsos under mottled hides, bristles rising along backs. Half-wild pigs, not domestic, not penned. They bore the marks of past fences broken, of stubborn lives lived beyond farm rows. Scarred flanks, tails coarse and flicking. Their trotters tore up clumps of wet grass as they circled the clearing. The ranger strained against blood pounding in her skull and forced her eyes to focus. One pig lifted its head and stared fully at her. That gaze gave pause, more than animal instinct there. Curiosity, a recognition of strangeness. It grunted low, and the other two angled closer, nostrils flaring at the salt of sweat that hung heavy around her. "Hey," she rasped. A word scraped raw from a throat long dry. Weak, broken, but something. Her voice staggered into the silence. For a moment, nothing in those small black eyes shifted. Then one pig stepped nearer, pressing its snout against the worn leather of her boot. It rooted, shuffled, then sneezed. The touch sent her body swinging slightly, agony shooting up her spine. Rope bit deeper. She hissed in pain, but the sound made the pig tilt its head sideways, ears twitching. Another shuffled up beside its companion, both looming just beneath her, inspecting her like some hanging fruit they couldn't quite identify. Their bodies carried mud streaks, and leaf tangles clung to their bristles, proof they'd forced paths through rough brush. They weren't lost. They weren't tame, either. They moved with the kind of stubborn independence she knew from men who lived without orders for too long. A band of their own, 3 driven more by bond than by fence line. Her training always pushed her toward calculation. What did she have? What did the land give? Where was her opening? Now, no blade, no freedom of movement. Only 3 pigs circling, making sounds that seemed half idle, half considering. She tried again, whispering louder, though the blood returning to her throat made every breath burn. "Help! Here!" The pigs grunted back. Not language, not answer, more a vibration of presence. But one lifted and pressed its snout toward the rope at her ankle. Not to tear, not yet. Just a testing nudge. That single touch shocked her far more than if they'd bolted. It meant recognition. Something about her mattered to them. She closed her eyes for half a second, steadied resolve. Out here, in a wilderness where bears could sniff corpses and scavengers clean bones, the last thing she might have expected was an audience that stayed. Animals blink in and vanish. But these remained, circling, testing each movement, never straying more than a yard. She trembled with thirst. Lips cracked. She tried to swallow, but her throat rasped dry. Still, she tilted her head toward them and breathed shallow words. "Don't leave." Half plea, half command. Training whispered, "Maintain will, project strength, even when broken." But the truth bled through anyway. She needed them. The forest shifted tone, carrying faint creaks through high limbs. Light golden now, afternoon pushing, time slipping. Each heartbeat lost was a step closer to organs failing. She knew it. Her body told it. And yet, every grunt from the pigs pulled her further from the cliff in her mind, as if their presence, stubborn as roots breaking stone, gave her minutes she shouldn't have had. They began to explore the tree itself. One ran its shoulder against the trunk, rubbing mud into scarred bark. Another stretched front legs high, hooves scraping. She swayed dangerously, choking against the sudden jolt as the rope bounced. But she did not curse them. She let the motion carry a fragile flicker of hope. Testing the same rope that held her, if only they knew pressure at the right point. All the while they stayed near. None wandered off into brush. Their eyes returned again and again to her upside-down form, regarding her with a patience she could not fathom. Maybe they saw weakness. Maybe they smelled pain. Or maybe, in the mystery of wild kinship, they simply decided the clearing wasn't finished until they named her part of it. She had seen that look once among combat friends. The pause before hauling someone too broken to move. The unspoken choice to shoulder weight that could crush both. In pig eyes, it looked different. Sharper. Blacker. but the shape of it was the same. Her chest ached. She whispered ragged, "Good, good pigs." Words scarcely air. Another grunt answered. And here, alone where no human ear could hear, she allowed herself something close to faith. Minutes dragged like hours. The pain built walls around thought, pressing closer. But at the edges of that pain were 3 bodies grounding her to earth. They pawed soil, they shifted, they sniffed. Each noise reminded her she was not yet abandoned entirely. Would they free her? She didn't know. They could leave before sun dipped. They could tire, turn their backs and vanish into thicket. But they hadn't. Not yet. Suspended above root and earth, every nerve screaming, she held to that single truth. The pigs had arrived, and they lingered. It was not rescue, not salvation. But it was something larger than silence, and sometimes the difference between silence and sound is the difference between living long enough for one more step forward. The pigs pressed closer. Their sides brushed one another as they circled beneath, grunting and blowing air through their snouts. Sunlight shimmered down in fractured shafts, catching the rope's twisted fibers above her trapped ankles. Her breath rattled in bursts, ribs aching from the strain of inverted weight. Every second stretched her nerve thin. One pig rose on hind legs, nosing along the rope where it hugged bark. The tree shuddered with the pressure. She swung violently, a shock of pain splitting across her skull as blood surged harder through her face. She bit back a cry, afraid the sound would scatter them. They dropped back to the dirt, trotting a few tight circles before returning. Persistent, not giving up. That steadiness sparked a thread of something in her chest she hadn't felt in hours. Possibility. She rasped again, voice raw as gravel. Rope. Here words were feeble, but purpose filled them. One pig tilted its head, then wandered beneath her dangling form. It lifted its snout to her boot, nudged, and snorted sharply. Her body rocked again, nerves screaming, but she clung to the sway. At least it felt like motion toward life. The second pig clamped teeth against the rope trailing beside her. The fibers groaned faintly under the bite. She froze, hope flooding fierce as fire. But after a moment, the pig released, chewing at nothing, confused by the stubborn texture. It pawed the dirt and huffed, irritated. Her heart sank. That single instant had been so close, yet failure pressed tighter than before. She spoke again, throat burning. Bite. Hold. Pull. Each syllable cracked the dry air. The pigs shifted at her tone, even when words made no sense to them. Intent carried. They stepped near, pressing into bark, scattering debris. Their weight made the rope quiver, but still it held. Minutes blurred. She felt heat gathering behind her eyes, the world flashing at its edges. Her skull throbbed from blood rushing wrong ways. Despair seeped in. This was folly. Training never mentioned pigs as rescue partners. She nearly let her lids close, surrendering to black. Then one pig hooked its lower jaw against the cord, bruising her ankle. It didn't gnaw aimlessly this time. It dragged. Fibers strained, a faint snap whispering through the wood. Her body jolted hard, forcing air from her chest. The tree branch groaned overhead. Adrenaline surged like a jolt of current through her failing arms. Yes, she gasped. Only sound that reached her own ragged ears. She tried to shift her weight, twisting hips slightly to guide tension against the right angle. Pain seared through joints, but the rope pinched looser for a heartbeat. The pig snarled as it jerked again. This was not deliberate knowledge, not planned rescue, but raw, stubborn energy set exactly where it mattered. The other two suddenly joined, grunting, pushing, gnawing lower along strands. She swayed, bruised, battered, but every pull rubbed hope clearer. She tried to command. Again. Pull. Each word an iron rasp. Her vision pulsed, white, then dark. Still, she forced eyelids wide, demanded herself to witness this moment. Failure returned quick. The pigs tugged one angle wrong, spinning her sideways. Pain ripped across ribs as she slammed against trunk. A cry burst free, involuntary, echoing sharp across still pines. The animal startled, scattering back a few paces. Horror clenched her chest. What if they fled, lost courage and abandoned? They didn't. Hesitant but unwilling to quit, they reapproached. Mud streaking their hides, panting from effort. She whispered, softer now, coaxing. Good pigs. Stay, please. They lingered, ears twitching, eyes black dots fixed on her swaying shape. Pressure built again at ankles, testing, nibbling. They were erratic, clumsy, unguided, but persistence returned like tide. Her mind carved a memory then, a desert patrol. One comrade dragging another by sheer brute grip, clumsy, near deadly, but kept alive. The image mingled with these creatures pulling rope fibers strand by strand, unaware of the burden they moved toward salvation. Time fractured. Seconds, minutes, she couldn't tell. Each twitch of rope felt like an hour. Each silence, a year. Yet slowly, fibers loosened. A fray tickled at her skin. Relief surged only to crash again as progress stalled. Her body numbed, then reignited with agony. Cycles that tore sanity thin. At last, one pig planted forelegs hard against trunk, using full trunk weight to wrench rope sideways. Twang split the quiet. Pressure gave. For the first time since she'd hung bound, her ankle slipped fractionally within Loop's bite. She nearly screamed, not from pain, but from the electric shock of change. Again, she whispered, teeth crimson with blood where lips had cracked. Do it. Her mind bent command into prayer. And again, the pig tugged. The cord spun tighter against bark, strands whining shrilly, muscles seared like fire inside her calves. Then collapse happened abrupt, half slack rolling down, her body crashing downward inches. Head seared, lungs buckled, but hope blazed. They had found the angle. One final heave and rope loosened further. She dangled lower, branch above creaking from lost tension. Still not free, but closer. Exhaustion crushed her chest. She swallowed broken air, letting salt tears burn eyes. Below her, 3 pigs panted, sides quivering with effort. They had no script, no reason, nothing to gain. Yet they gnawed and pulled still, bound to persistence itself. She realized then, relief could snap to despair within one heartbeat. If rope tore wrong, she might land neck first. If pigs tired now, she'd fade before another chance. Every path was razor edge. But still, the fact remained. They had loosened what man's cruelty had fixed. With her broken body and their stubborn teeth, she stood closer to ground than an hour before. She clenched fists behind back, pressing numb fingers into rope, searching leverage. Blood slick, hopeless alone. This burden now belonged to them as much as hers. When one grunted loud and yanked sideways again, fibers shrieked. Pressure slipped. A sliver of air rushed through her chest with delirious laughter not quite formed. For a razor moment, life tilted toward escape, and though darkness pressed at her skull, she fought consciousness like soldier on last ridge, because now she believed, against odds, against reason, they might yet cut her free. The rope split at last, with a sound that cracked through the trees. In the same instant, gravity claimed her. She plunged downward, body folding under its own weight, back and shoulders striking hard into soil packed by centuries of pine needles. Air fled from her lungs in one ragged burst. She gasped, but her chest seized. For long, terrifying seconds, no breath returned, as though the forest itself refused to allow it. Her limbs lay useless. Muscles, long starved of blood, twitched spasmodically, each nerve firing with confused pain. The world tilted sideways, shadows doubling, sun flaring sharp, then dissolving into gray. She knew she was back on the ground, but a body didn't feel like her own. Entire swaths of muscle remained numb, spine singing with fresh injury. She opened her mouth, but only a hiss escaped, shallow as wind through grass. The pigs crowded immediately, their rhythm broken by her sudden collapse. They whirled around her sprawled figure, grunting anxiously, ears flicking every direction. One pressed its broad snout into her shoulder, shoving lightly as though urging her up. Another nosed along her ribs, movements careful but insistent, trying to rouse whatever spark of motion lingered. The third circled wider, stamping the dirt, then returned close, pressing flank against her back to keep her turned. She tried to roll, but her arms had no strength. Numbness flooded hands like stone. More than once she nearly slipped into unconsciousness again. Still, every time her eyes fluttered shut, one of the pigs nudged sharply, preventing full surrender. Their persistence wove a cord between her and waking that pain alone could not hold. Her throat rasped dry. "Stay," she whispered without volume, but she knew they heard. Their grunts came in response, low and grounding. She let herself rest against that rough cadence, because no other heartbeat kept her anchored now. Fear of solitude pressed heavy. If these animals left her, she understood with grim finality, nothing else in this wilderness would. The minutes that followed dragged like hours. She couldn't rise. Each attempt ended with dizziness rolling through her skull and lights bursting across vision. Sweat cooled, then dried against her clammy skin. The ground leached warmth fast, and shivers took hold. She clenched teeth against them, but control slipped each time. The pigs adjusted, pressing closer, sharing heat through their coarse-bristled hides, a living wall that shielded her from cold breeze scuttling through grass. Their bodies smelled of soil and musk, but that raw warmth was the only shield between her and shock. Once she managed to push onto an elbow. The world tilted immediately. Her sight flared white. A groan broke loose without permission. The pigs responded with a sudden chorus of snorts, anxiety pressed sharp into sound. One shoved its head under her ribs gently and tried to lift, but her body flopped uselessly backward. She gasped, ashamed at her weakness and yet powerless. Tears burned without her permission. She had carried dying comrades once, and here she lay unable to lift herself. The pigs didn't waver. They settled instead, forming a protective ring. Their restless eyes darted to the underbrush, ears sharp to every crack and flutter. She realized with a jolt that they were keeping watch. Guardians who had no reason to guard. Each time she coughed, one brushed nearer, nudging until her breathing steadied again. Dehydration set its claws soon after. Her lips cracked, tongue felt thick and useless. She attempted to speak, but words died half-made. Still, some instinct told her their refusal to leave meant she wasn't yet condemned. Her own trust in man had been torn by the ambush hours before. Yet here, animals took up the burden men had abandoned. She blinked into their steady dark eyes and felt something stir dangerously close to gratitude. A thought clawed at her. In war, she had seen comrades refuse to leave a broken soldier behind. The same pulse beat here, through creatures shaped not by duty, but bond. That knowledge lifted shame from her chest enough for another dry breath. As sun slid westward, shadows thickened under pines. Her weakness grew devastating. She could neither defend herself nor flee. Any predator could end it swiftly. Yet none approached. Maybe scent of pigs kept them at bay. Maybe some quieter tether bound her to life. Stillness claimed the forest, as though acknowledging this fragile pact. The ranger shifted faintly, curling nearer their warmth. A tremor of will pushed through paralysis. She understood at last that survival had become a shared task. Alone she could not rise, could not crawl. But with their bodies guarding flame against wind, she might stretch her hours into one more dawn. Her lips cracked wider when she whispered, "You're my lifeline." It was confession, and it startled her. Across years she had leaned only on training, tools, her own endurance. Yet that had now fractured. Animals she once might have waved away had bound themselves into the weight of her living. One pig exhaled hot breath against her cheek, close as any soldier's silent vow. She let head rest back. Time blurred. Waves of ache rose and fell, but presence remained. The night ahead promised nothing good. Her chest burned dry. Her muscles throbbed with loss. Yet a flicker of recognition whispered behind her eyes. She wasn't alone in Death's Valley yet. The ranger closed her eyes briefly, pain and trust colliding. She had no promise of morning, but 3 stubborn pigs would not abandon her through the deepest hours. In that truth, she found enough strength to breathe once more, enough to believe dawn might arrive. She awoke to the weight of snouts nudging at her ribs, sharp grunts threading through the hush of pine. The sun had climbed, spilling light across needled ground. Her body roared with pain, every limb reluctant to move. Yet the pigs refused to let stillness claim her. They pressed with insistent prods until she lifted head and forced bleary eyes open. Air burned in lungs, but she found breath enough to speak. "Forward," she whispered, the word little more than breath. One pig tilted its head, dark eye fixed on hers. Another shifted close, allowing her shoulder to rest against rough bristled hide. They braced until she managed to drag herself upright, swaying, half collapsing again. She leaned into them, chest hitching. "Help me walk." Perhaps meaningless to their ears, yet her intent registered. They pressed together, forming a kind of moving wall. She slung arms weakly across their broad backs. Shivers racked her frame, but she staggered onto her feet, held between them. Pain splintered through knees and ribs, but it was motion, life. Step followed step, jagged and unstable. The ground was uneven, tangled with roots. Each stumble pitched her forward, but heavy shoulders braced beneath. They squealed when her weight became too sudden, yet they never pulled away. Instead, they pressed back into her until balance returned. It was clumsy, slow progress, but progress nonetheless. The forest rose like a trial, fallen branches blocking narrow ways, gullies waiting for careless steps. She dragged feet like stone. Sweat poured cold down her face despite the chill. At one point she slipped down onto her knees. The pigs gathered swiftly, pushing at her ribs, grunting wild protests until she clawed upright again. Every falter folded time backward. She was no longer a ranger staggering toward camp, but a soldier again. Sandstorms. Patrol routes where comrades carried one another through enemy fire. The same iron weight pressed her. Bodies too weak to save themselves, moving only because others bore their burden. The memory sharpened tears in her eyes. She swiped them away, unwilling to blur sight. Here, at least, 3 stubborn pigs had taken that role. Hours seemed to pass, though sun had only shifted marginally. Her breath came ragged, each inhalation cutting. Still, each glance showed their presence, 3 bodies steady beside her. When she groaned with fatigue, one turned its head as if to chide her. "Keep moving," she muttered broken praise. "Good pigs. Strong pigs." Words cracked, but they came with a ghost of a smile. Had any comrade carried her so patiently? Maybe once, long ago. But never had loyalty surprised her in such an unlikely form. The terrain rose toward a ridge, slope slick with pine needles. Her boots slipped again and again. She braced hands in mud, shoulders collapsing. But 2 pigs pushed from behind with steady force until, inch by slow inch, she crested the rise. The 3rd waited at top, ready flank pressing like a rail to prevent a backward slide. At the ridge, wind opened up. Distant horizon bled orange with late sun. Her chest ached, but air filled deeper than before. She coughed hard, spat blood into leaves, and pressed forward. Their support allowed another 100 staggering steps. By dusk she could hardly stand, body twisting weary and raw. She murmured hoarse agreements to herself. One more stride, one more patch of dirt. The wilderness did not bend to pity, but somehow they forced its quiet edges to cradle them. Finally, in the last light, the ground dipped toward a shallow cave. Its mouth yawned, dark but familiar. Once she had marked it on patrol as simple shelter for passing storms. Now it shimmered like salvation. She nearly collapsed at sight, knees buckling, breath sobbing out. The pigs sensed destination. They guided her into the entrance, bodies closing in when she stumbled sideways. Inside, rock walls hugged close, still holding heat of day. She sank down against cold stone, shaking uncontrollably. For long minutes she had no strength to move. Only shallow consciousness held, anchored by their shapes looming protectively at the cave mouth. They snorted into dimness, ears twitching at sounds beyond. Dark pressed fast. Yet warmth gathered again as they circled near, one pressing its flank against her chest, another curling at her feet, the last settling at her side like a guard. Tears slipped from her eyes uncontrolled. She covered face with shaking hands, whispering again through cracked lips, "Thank you." The cave held them. Beyond, the forest braced itself for night. Predators would soon stir, shadows crawling out to claim the undergrowth. But she was no longer alone, strung against sky. She had reached shelter, half on her feet, half carried by will of creatures that refused yielding. Night rode in without ceremony. Shadows poured through the cave mouth until the trees outside melted into one black wall. The ranger leaned against the rock, her chest rising in shallow, uneven rhythm. Pain burned low in ribs, muscles ached from hours of strain, and thirst cut harsh circles in her throat. When she lifted an arm, it trembled before falling limp again. She whispered once, a dry rasp, "Water," though no brook sang within distance. The pigs had not left. Their bodies pressed close, heavy heat radiating into her broken frame. One settled at her feet, the second pressed shoulder against her hip. The third tucked beneath her arm as though claiming that hollow as shelter. Their bristles scratched skin raw, but she welcomed it. Their presence fought back the creeping cold crawling in through cracks of stone. When shivers seized her body, their warmth steadied her enough to draw another breath. Each sound outside struck like a hammer. Branches snapped under weight. The heavy wing beat of an owl passed overhead. Every noise spoke danger. Predators stirred beyond the cave. She could not flee, not defend herself. Her hand groped for a knife that was no longer bound to her belt. She had been stripped of tools, stripped of certainty. Only these animals stood between her broken body and the empty hunger of the forest. Her ears rang with old memory. In desert nights of service she had lain awake, every whisper of wind carrying the thought of ambush. The air back then had smelled of dust and gun oil. Tonight, it was rich with pine sap and musk of pigs. Fear had the same weight either way. Yet here, unlike then, she was guarded not by men with rifles, but creatures whose language she did not understand. One stirred. The pig at her feet rose briefly, snout pressing into dirt as if rooting for something hidden. It returned moments later with a clump of wild root dangling from its jaw. The creature dropped it near her arm, grunting an impatient command. She stared in disbelief. Her mouth cracked wider with a silent laugh too dry to voice. Shaking hands lifted the root, brushed soil. She gnawed, teeth struggling to break the fibers. Bitter taste flooded her mouth, but juice seeped, moisture enough to wet her tongue. Her body shuddered with relief. Tears streaked dirty cheeks. "You're saving me," she whispered, voice cracking. None of them flinched. They only huddled closer, eyes black beads glinting faintly in half-light. She bit again, forcing the bitter mass down. It hurt to swallow, but liquid traced her raw throat. From one pig's instinctive gift, life lengthened by fragile minutes. They repeated the act. Awake through dark hours, pigs pushed out into the forest edge, rooting and returning with stems, tubers, small scraps of edible earth. She consumed what she could, spitting fiber, swallowing moisture. Each time they returned, she broke harder inside. Men had undone her with cruelty, but these animals stitched hope back with persistence. At intervals, she dozed. Dreams blurred with memory, illumination flares in desert skies blending with sparks of fireflies here, shouts of patrol comrades mixing with soft grunts beside her chest. She woke each time to the pressure of warm bodies pressing closer, ensuring she had not drifted empty into cold. In silence, she wept freely. Trust came then, hesitant at first. She had built walls thick as stone, carved by years when comrades fell and promises dissolved. Trusting chance had cost lives before. Yet her survival now hung by thread, offered from beings who had no word, no duty. Instinct alone wove this bond. She surrendered to it because there was no other choice, and because something human inside her craved it. Hours crept slowly. Once, distant howls rang through the valley. Her heart froze. Muscles tensed in reflex, though strength failed her trembling arms. At Cave's mouth the pigs bristled, hacked bristles rising like spears. They stood shoulder to shoulder, snorting low growls deep in their throats. She marveled through fear. They would guard. They knew threat when they heard it. The howls faded, swallowed by distance. Still the pigs watched, long after, steady sentinels refusing to yield their post. When dawn finally seeped gray across sky, she blinked against pale light filtering through trees. Her body ached beyond telling. Every breath remained a knife, yet she was still alive. The pigs stirred restlessly, shaking earth from bristles, but none fled. Their dark eyes turned back to her, quiet, waiting. She pushed herself higher on one elbow with great effort. "We made it," she whispered, voice barely air. One pig snorted, snout nudging her thigh. She reached with shaking palm to rest against its coarse hide. For the first time since ambush, her lips edged a ghost of a smile. That fragile dawn carried a truth she had not admitted before. Survival now belonged not to her skill with weapons, nor to training manuals that once guided every act. Survival here had sprung from loyalty born in the most unlikely shape. So she made a vow under faint glow of morning. "I'll get us through," she promised softly. Not just for herself, for them. They had kept her breathing through black hours. She would live forward, if only to honor their stubborn, wordless rescue. The day had barely started to breathe when the forest shifted again. Morning light slanted through needles, thin and worn, and the ranger's cracked lips drew shallow sips of air. The pigs were restless. Their hooves scraped in nervous rhythm at the cave's threshold, ears twitching toward distant disturbances she had not yet picked out in her weary haze. It wasn't until the faint murmur of voices strayed through branches that her pulse spiked. Men. Too close. She jolted with effort, trying to push herself upright. Bones throbbed rebellion at the surge, but instinct screamed louder. The voices rolled in, gruff syllables broken by bursts of coarse laughter. She knew the cadence, knew the careless weight of poachers moving without fear in stolen woods. Panic surged, violent enough to blind. She could not run, not this time. Muscles screamed for water and strength she didn't have. Any thought of hiding collapsed beneath the truth. She was too weak to crawl 3 steps, let alone vanish into pine cover. Her chest froze, leaving her trapped between breath and silence. The pigs, however, altered instantly. Their hackles stood, bristles flaring sharp as thorns. Low growls rumbled from their throats, strange sound for animals known more for grunts and squeals. Their bodies stiffened into a stubborn wall between her prone figure and the cave mouth. She watched through fogged vision as they aligned themselves, shoulder to shoulder, as though some unspoken command bound them. The men drew closer. Smell of smoke and cheap liquor drifted first, then scraps of their words cut clearer. "Track's here, she ain't far," another voice chuckled darkly. "Buzzards'll be circling already." Their cruelty carried like a second wound across her chest. She clenched her fists weakly. Fury swelled, useless in her veins. They thought she was carrion already. Closer still, bootsteps pressed against pine needle floor. Dry twigs snapped under careless weight. Shadows stretched at the far edge of vision. She bit down on her lip until blood filled her mouth, praying the pigs would hold silent in their guard. Instead, they released deeper growls, throaty and fierce. Fear spiked. If pigs charged, they'd reveal her. If they fled, she'd be exposed. Her body trembled, mind racing with dire outcomes. But the pigs didn't flee. They rooted hooves to the dirt, heads lowered, mouths pulled back to reveal blunt but determined tusks. Her fear twisted with awe. No words had trained them, no leash held them. Yet they had chosen their line of defense. The poachers paused just beyond clear sight. One barked a bitter laugh. "Wild hogs out here too, listen." Another answered, mocking, "Mean little things when cornered." "Let's not spook 'em." Boots shuffled uncertainly, the tone less arrogant now. A silence swelled heavy enough to suffocate before one of the voices muttered, "No corpse worth taking if hogs already stirred. Let's swing north." Relief like water cascaded through her chest as their voices drifted away with distance. Faint cracks of twigs faded, then grew smaller, until the forest swallowed them. She sagged back, forehead pressing against cold rock, strength hemorrhaging from the brief rush of adrenaline. Her breath came in shaking bursts. The pigs lingered taut and vigilant, gazes fixed outward until the last echo died. Only then did they turn back, grunting softly, eyes scanning her as though demanding confirmation she still lived. One pressed snout against her shoulder, another pawed at the dirt beside her. She reached trembling fingers toward the closest and brushed coarse bristle. "You saved me again," she whispered, voice breaking under strain. The weight of realization burned inside her. Men had crushed her, left her for ruin, and come again to finish their cruelty with mockery. Yet the animals had interposed themselves, willing to face violence on her behalf. That image burrowed deeper into her than any lash of pain. Protection, uncompelled and pure. For a long moment, the cave brimmed with silence. The forest outside breathed careful again, wind shifting resinous sighs through branches. Her heart began to steady, though weakness gripped hard. She closed eyes briefly, imagination sparking visions of what might have been. Discovery, laughter, another binding and an end, swift or slow. If not for these pigs, that nightmare would have bloomed real. The ranger drew breath slow, every rib protesting. Still, she kept eyes closed, whispering broken gratitude. You bristled against their boots. You held when I couldn't. Tears streaked through grime across her cheeks, but she let them fall unchecked. This wasn't weakness. It was recognition. Life continued on the shoulders of three creatures who had no reason to care. By the time she eased her eyes open, the pigs had settled back down. They didn't collapse entirely. They remained near the entrance, heads turning at smallest rustle. Sentinels, still. She knew sleep wouldn't come easy. Not now, not with danger brushing so close. But she also knew she no longer faced it abandoned. That revelation carved stone deep into her marrow. Morning advanced, stronger, carrying birdsong hesitant but clear, as if the forest itself marked survival of something meant gone. She adjusted an inch closer to the pigs, laying back against rock, and exhaled, ragged release. The poachers believed her dead, their tracks cut away. Yet she continued, shielded by a loyalty inexplicable and unearned. In that single truth, she found the thinnest strand of faith. Whatever tomorrow demanded, it would find her still defended by three stubborn guards, who had already proven more steadfast than most humans she'd ever known. Morning gave way to a harsher light, the kind that stripped shadow from branches and laid every weakness bare. The ranger stirred inside the cave, and knew quickly that her body was failing. Ribs ached sharp with every breath. Legs trembled even before she shifted weight. Wounds pulsed with unrelenting fire. Blood still dried thick against her skin. She pressed a palm against the stone as she rose. Her arm shook involuntarily, nearly sending her back down. Yet she understood. If she stayed here, hunger and infection would finish what ropes and fists had begun. If poachers returned on another pass, there would be no hiding, no protection, not even with three animals pressed against her side. She blinked at the pigs, clustered near the entrance. One nudged dirt with its snout, restless to move. Another fixed black eyes on her, patient but waiting. The third shifted closer, shoulder brushing her knee. They hadn't left. Through night and danger, they had kept her breathing. Now they waited for what came next, though surely they didn't know the human word for rescue or station. Still, instinct told her. They somehow sensed where she needed to go. "We push," she whispered, voice nearly gone. Her body rose carefully under the brace of two pigs leaning heavy against either side. When her knees buckled, their solid weight held her upright. She slung arms across their bristled backs and staggered toward the cave mouth. Pain shot like fire through torn muscles, but movement carried her into fragile daylight. The wilderness stretched wide and merciless beyond. Terrain jutted in slopes and gullies. Fallen logs forced detours. Roots clawed up through earth like waiting snares. She stumbled often, each collapse nearly catastrophic, yet every time pigs pressed shoulder or flank until she lurched upright again. Her breath stuttered ragged. Sweat poured. But steps accumulated, halting, trembling, unstoppable. Then came the river. Its current wasn't wide, but fast enough to sweep weak bodies from balance. She froze at bank's edge, staring at the surge of water. Her knees shook, fear rising loud in chest. Once she'd crossed rivers under fire, boots dragging comrades through current lit with muzzle flashes. Now a simple stream threatened final undoing. She whispered aloud, "Can't do it." But the pigs entered without hesitation. Splashes arced as they stepped forward steadily, bristled backs rising above water. One paused, turning its head back toward her as if commanding to follow. She clenched teeth, lowered to knees, and dragged herself into the bitter cold. Current pushed hard, but bodies boxed her, one in front, one behind, one steadying at her side. She kept a grip along coarse hair, and together they forced through. When her boots touched stony shore again, laughter burst from her lungs, wild with relief. "We did it," she rasped. Onward lay slopes that bit into her feet. Loose shale slid beneath boots, tumbling her sideways. Her weight threatened to drag them down, but with determined squeals they steadied her. One dropped shoulder forward so she could brace against the climb. Pain radiated, each pulse hammering behind eyes, but distance closed slowly. Her vision swam. Memories collided. Desert patrol. Bloodied men carried over ridges. The taste of ash in air. She muttered, half to herself, half to them. Same march, different war. By late afternoon, lungs burned raw, body near collapse. Hunger clawed as much as wounds. Pigs foraged briefly, rooting at earth, bringing her bits of moss and damp root to chew. She accepted with tear-stung eyes, swallowing bitterness for the moisture it granted. Then again they pressed onward. Close to dusk, she staggered into a clearing she faintly recognized. Slopes familiar, terrain softened by remembered patrol routes. Relief struck so hard it buckled her knees. Only a stretch more and the ranger station stood. She crumpled, but they shoved noses under arms and shoulders, refusing surrender. With their grunts echoing around her, she lifted once more. Steps turned to a crawl. Every breath pounded agony. Darkness edged vision. Yet the pigs braced her weight, nudging, herding, never letting her slump fully to soil. Each collapse ended with a push of their bodies against hers. That stubbornness carried her forward, far past limits. Near twilight, she crested a final rise. Through thinning trees, she glimpsed faint rooftops, a silhouette etched against falling sky. The outpost. Her home base. So close her body shook with desperate release. She fell to knees, sobbing quietly. Pigs circled, grunting impatiently as if demanding she finish what began. She gathered the last dregs of will under that insistence. Step by step, bruised feet dragging, she moved down slope. The pigs bracketed her like sentinels. When her knees gave way entirely, they pressed until her hands reached dirt just before station walls. She collapsed upon threshold, heart pounding shallow but triumphant, pigs standing like stone around her. Without them, that path would have been grave. With them, she had carved route back to safety against hopeless odds. That truth settled deeper than pain. These animals hadn't just wandered. They had borne her broken body through wilderness, refusing to abandon. And as twilight fell quiet and thin, she lay staring at familiar timber beneath fading sky, alive utterly, because 3 pigs had chosen not to turn away. The ranger lay slumped at the threshold of the outpost, face pressed into soil she had known for years. Dimly, she registered the rough timbers rising just ahead, weathered wood that smelled of pine tar and smoke. Her chest rose shallow, strained nearly to breaking, but breath still came. Around her, 3 pigs stood rigid, mud-streaked flanks quivering, black eyes surveying every corner of the clearing. They did not scatter at the sight of human settlement. They closed in, as though this outpost was theirs to guard. Boots pounded suddenly, heavy on planks. A shout cracked out. "Ranger down!" Voices she knew wandered through haze, coworkers rushing from bunks and offices, uniforms blurred by tears obscuring her sight. Hands fell upon her shoulders, urgent. She flinched at touch, instincts braced for cruelty, but the grip steadied, lifted, carried. Through broken focus, she glimpsed men and women she'd ridden patrol with. Fear etched their eyes. One bent close to check pulse. Another shouted for medic kit. None of them noticed her murmured whisper. "Not me alone." Only later did they widen eyes at the pigs arrayed like a barricade. Coarse bristles shone in twilight, tusk stubs sharp, postures protective. "Wild hogs," someone muttered nervously. But when a ranger reached for her arm, one pig snapped jaws in warning, holding ground until she released a faint note of reassurance. "They're mine. They saved me." The words cracked painfully out, no louder than a hush, yet carried weight enough. Hearing her voice dulled the animals' tension, snouts lowered. Still they hovered, unwilling to step back farther than a pace. The others exchanged doubtful glances, yet obeyed, allowing pigs their perimeter while they lifted her towards cot inside. She drifted in and out, while saline 1-5 pierced flesh. Gauze pressed ribs. Cool water poured between cracked lips. She groaned under touch, but relief surged anyway. Between each blink she searched until vision settled back on those familiar forms pressing against doorframe. They waited with the patience of centuries. Night settled quicker than thought. Pain dulled under medicine, but clarity sharpened. She understood truth. Without those animals, she'd remain tied to a tree, body failing beneath indifferent sky. No combat experience, no muscle memory, no survival textbook had spared her. Only 3 stubborn pigs rooting inexplicably through wilderness until they found her. Colleagues asked questions in murmurs. How'd she get here? Who attacked? She gave broken answers, piecemeal, but heart clung elsewhere. When water touched her lips, she whispered again, "Double check. They're still there?" A young ranger at window peered out. "They haven't left," he confirmed, confusion lacing tone. She closed her eyes, tears burning. Loyalty had taken shape in bristled hides tonight. A loyalty steadier than many men. Once, across desert patrols, she had known bond of soldiers carrying one another to safety. Years later, that same bond returned, not in squad mates, but in 3 pigs. The revelation rang almost absurd, but truth never bowed to expectation. At dawn, light filtered through shutters, spilling across bandaged chest. She woke fully then, hearing low grunts outside. She demanded weakly to rise, and though colleagues protested, she insisted. Boots unsteady, she walked a few paces onto porch. There they stood, 3 shapes resting on cool soil, black eyes lifting as she approached. Their breaths steamed faintly in chill morning. Upon sight of her upright figure, they trotted forward, nudging gently at her knees. Weak laughter escaped her, painful but alive. She crouched, staggering, and pressed both hands into coarse hides. "You didn't leave me," she whispered. Words carried more weight than medals, more weight than survival manuals or ranks she had once held. "You didn't leave me." This was the revelation. Hand against dirty flank, she smiled through fresh tears. Behind her, fellow rangers watched, silent. None dared move closer. They recognized something sacred in rough communion before them. It was not training, not blood rule, not command that had borne her back. It was a wild, wordless loyalty. She knew scars lacing her body would mark her forever, but now they spoke not only of violence endured. They spoke of resilience built together between human frailty and three resolute pigs. And so Act 9 closed. Rescue achieved. Revelation carved deep. She had been carried home, but home itself now looked different. Resilience redefined by the unexpected loyalty of animals who refused to abandon her in the wilderness. Recovery stretched into long, uneven weeks. The ranger lay bandaged in a narrow cot, while sunlight pooled through shutters, thin but certain. Each dawn carried her further from the brink she had balanced on, yet scars drew their own permanent map under skin. Her ribs healed crooked, her stride slowed by aches that would never vanish. Still, she accepted these costs with quiet resolve. Scars were not weakness, they were witnesses. What surprised her most was not the pain, but the company she kept. The three pigs remained close, roaming the outpost with fearless stubbornness. Some colleagues grumbled at first, wary of their tusks and size. But the animals never left her, haunting the porch like guards, and soon even the most cautious rangers gave in, treating them as kin. Buckets of water were set out, scraps tossed willingly. The pigs settled in, half familiar, half wild, as if bridges between two worlds. She often found herself sitting outside, body still sore, watching sun slip low across the valley. The pigs sprawled at her feet, bristles coarse in dusk light. Their grunts blended with sounds of cicadas and wind dragging through pines. In those moments, she felt the wilderness differently. Less cruel, less indifferent. It was still harsh, still demanding, but it had offered her three sentinels when no human voice had answered her calls. Her thoughts circled back often to that tree. The rope cinched into flesh, the bitter certainty of death pressing close. She remembered fighting just to keep eyes open. And then, from nowhere, pigs had walked into the clearing. She had trained to trust only discipline, but discipline had snapped in rope strands. Her life had come not by method, but the loyalty of animals no one could explain. Each memory carved new perspective. She had lived once by doctrine, maps, commands, survival drills beaten into her bones. But resilience, she understood now, wasn't made only of preparation. It blossomed from chance bonds, unexpected kinship, and stubborn creatures that refused to vanish when all logic said they should. Sometimes at night, when she woke from dreams twisted with desert firefights or the jeering of poachers, she would step onto the porch, quietly. Always, one pig lifted its head first, eyes reflecting moonlight. Often the others stirred and rose as well, circling her with soft snorts. Their bodies brushed her legs, grounding her in present time. The fear retreated then. She would breathe easier and smile, weary but sure. As weeks turned to months, the ranger returned to partial duties. She walked shorter routes, leaning still on staff for support. Inevitably, the pigs followed. Their trotters clattered softly across stone, through mud, over ridges. They flanked her without instruction, pressing close during steep climbs, grunting each time she stumbled. It made her laugh dryly, in memory of those desperate treks through wilderness. The march towards safety had never truly ended. It had only stretched forward into existence itself. Colleagues often shook heads in disbelief. "Never seen anything like them," one murmured. She smiled but offered no explanation. How could she capture for them the moment when teeth at rope had turned despair into possibility? These pigs weren't pets, weren't wild threats. They were the tether between her and silence, She let mystery remain. On her porch, evenings ended with stillness. The animals lay curled, sometimes pushing noses against her boots as if to remind her that bond still held. She leaned back, listening to night's chorus, aware of bruises on ribs, aware of scars pulling skin tighter. She felt broken, yet whole. Her reflection deepened over time. She realized resilience was not about strength alone. Strength had failed when rope cut too deep and lungs squeezed to silence. Resilience had come through willingness to accept help, to lean against rough hides, to eat bitter roots brought by snouts, to admit tears unashamed amid bristled loyalty. It was humility, not just toughness, that had carried her back. And now the pigs belonged here as much as she did. They rooted in dirt beside the station, wallowed in shallow pits of water rangers dug for them. Children of nearby families visited, marveling at their gentleness. Wary respect turned to affection across the community. What had first been confusion soon became emblem of quiet town tradition. 3 pigs who guarded a ranger, who once saved her life. She didn't speak often of the ambush anymore. The memories cut harsh, but time softened edges. What she carried instead was the image of that clearing, sun slicing through branches, her vision fading, and 3 persistent figures circling. That was the moment her life had shifted. Not at wounds, not at collapse, but in the choice of animals who decided not to abandon her. On one particular dusk, she sat again on the porch, body tired from half-shift patrol. The air glowed copper, sky dimming into a curve of stars. The pigs circled lazily at her feet, curling to rest. She gazed outward, heart calm. Silence pressed deep, but no longer lonely. She whispered softly, almost to herself, yet meant for them. You gave me back more than breath. You gave me trust again. Their ears twitched, bodies heavy with rest. But she knew they heard. And so the stories close unfolded, not in battle's clash or triumph's shout, but in quiet resilience, a ranger scarred, but unbroken. 3 pigs turned kin, guardians of porch and path. In still wilderness, dusk falling slow, they breathed in unison. A stubborn rescue completed, a bond carved permanent. The ranger sat quiet on her porch, evening laying copper across the valley and bleeding slow into blue. Her ribs still ached where poachers' boots had struck, and where rope had carved flesh raw. But breath filled her lungs tonight without hindrance. Scars pulled at her skin, yes, but they no longer carried defeat. They told a story larger than hurt. At her feet, 3 pigs drifted in lazy circles, rooting softly at grass before curling against one another near her boots. Their bristled bodies formed a ring of steady companionship. She lifted her gaze toward ridgeline. The pines there raised black outlines against the last brightness of sky, steady as old sentries. Wind hushed through needles, a kind of music only wilderness could compose. For years she had sought refuge in such silence, filling her days alone on patrol, claiming she needed no living presence near. But now, experiencing this quiet alongside these animals, she realized silence did not need to equate to solitude. The wilderness could be vast, empty-seeming, yet filled with the bonds you least expected. Flashes of memory stirred sharply. The rope tightening, the bruises spreading, the void of consciousness rolling close. She shook against those images, but her gaze fell to the pigs snoozing in dusk, and calm returned. They had reshaped her understanding of survival entirely. For all her training, all her combat drills, none had included the concept of trusting wild pigs to shoulder weight or bring food. And yet, That was precisely what reality had demanded of her. Life persisted by unlikely means, not predictable ones. A colleague once told her that resilience was steel in the spine. She disagreed now. Real resilience was softer. Humility to lean when broken, to accept help where pride would resist it. These creatures had taught her what her fellow veterans, her field manuals, her pride never could. They had shown her survival can live not in strength alone, but in shared stubbornness, even from those beyond her species and comprehension. The station had grown used to their presence. Rangers muttered less about the pigs roaming near coops or leaning against porch posts. Children tugged at their ears in laughter. Locals left feet out, almost reverent. These pigs had become part of the place. Yet for her, they were more. They were kin, shaped by mud and bristle, carrying meaning heavier than anyone else could comprehend. Dark settled steadily, stars piercing quiet one by one. The ranger reached down, her fingers threading through coarse hide. One pig grunted low, shifting slightly to press against her shin. She let tears rise freely this time, falling down cheeks scarred by sun and storm. They weren't tears of despair anymore. They were tears carrying the weight of gratitude, unexpected as it was enduring. Her voice cracked as she whispered into night air. "They left me to die. But you chose otherwise." The phrase hung solid, carved against growing dark. That was the truth she wished others grasped. Men had broken her, discarded every part of her body like trash. Yet animals, without word or oath, had stood between her and death's finish. For the rest of her years, she would carry that truth like a compass. She leaned back against chairs' worn slats, eyes steady on distant ridge. Wolves might roam there still. Poachers might creep through darker gullies. But none of those shadows owned her anymore. She had walked back from brink by strength of 3 unlooked-for companions. The future might cut paths of trial again, that much she knew. Yet she did not dread it, because she no longer considered herself alone. The silence deepened, thick, yet no longer empty. Constancy pulsed against her calves where warm bodies pressed. Her hand rested along rough hide, and she closed eyes, carried safe on rhythmic snorts of pigs breathing slow at her feet. And if you enjoyed that, consider subscribing for more rural rescues and hard luck animals. Share where you're watching from, and join the stories that remind us that sometimes loyalty and survival arrive in the most unexpected, stubborn forms.